I was just about to leave for my husband's funeral when my grandson ran into the garage, pale and sobbing. He threw himself in front of the car. "Grandma, don't start the engine. Please don't start it." I froze, my hand on the keys. "What's going on?" "Just trust me," he begged. "We're leaving on foot." A moment later, my phone started vibrating over and over with calls from my children. "Don't answer," Dean pleaded. "Before I go on, I'm glad you're here. Stay with my story until the end and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story travels. My name is Phyllis, and I never imagined that the day of my husband's funeral would also be the day I learned how little my own children valued my life. I stood in the garage, keys trembling in my hand as I stared at Roman's black sedan. The same car he'd driven for 12 years. The same car that still held the faint scent of his cologne and the peppermints he always kept in the center console. Today, I was supposed to drive it to the funeral alone. My children had insisted on taking their own cars to handle logistics. I should have sensed something was wrong when they were so eager to leave without me. The funeral was set for 11 a.m., and it was already 10:30. I'd spent the morning getting ready in the navy blue dress Roman always loved, the one he said made my eyes shine. My hands shook as I put on my lipstick, trying to look composed for the dozens of people who would be watching me say goodbye to the only man who had ever truly loved me. We'd been married for 38 years. 38 years of shared dreams, quiet Sunday mornings, and a love that deepened instead of fading. Roman had been my anchor, my closest friend, my whole world. The cancer took him so fast that I barely had time to understand what was happening before he was gone. I pressed the garage door opener and watched sunlight spill across the concrete. It was a beautiful day, which felt almost cruel. How could the sun shine so brightly on the worst day of my life? I walked to the driver's side, my black heels clicking on the floor. My purse felt unbearably heavy on my shoulder, stuffed with tissues I knew I'd need and the reading glasses I would use to follow the program. Everything felt unreal, as if I were standing outside myself, watching another woman live this life. That's when I heard footsteps. They were fast, frantic. I turned just as my 16-year-old grandson, Dean, burst through the door from the house to the garage. His face was almost gray, his eyes wide with terror. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he ran toward me. "Grandma, don't start the car," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Please, don't start the engine." Before I could move, he planted himself in front of the car, pressing his back against the hood like he was trying to physically hold it in place. His whole body shook, and he was crying so hard he could barely breathe. "Dean, what on earth?" I began, but he cut me off. "Don't get in the car, Grandma, please. We have to leave on foot. Right now." I stared at him, utterly confused. Dean had always been a sensitive boy, more thoughtful and kind than his father, my eldest son, Michael. But I had never seen him like this, never so terrified he could hardly form words. "Sweetheart, what's going on?" I asked, taking a step closer. "The funeral starts in 30 minutes. We can't walk there, it's 7 miles away." "We're not going to the funeral," he said, barely above a whisper. "We can't go. Grandma, you have to trust me. Something terrible is going to happen if you start this car." My heart began to pound. Dean wasn't the kind of boy to invent stories or stir up trouble. He was mature for his age, responsible, the kind of teenager who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and never missed an assignment. If he was this terrified, something was truly wrong. "Dean, you're scaring me," I said, reaching for his shoulder. "Tell me what's happening." He glanced toward the house, his eyes flicking to the windows as if he feared someone might be watching us. Then he grabbed my hand. His fingers were ice cold, despite the warm morning. "I heard them talking," he whispered. "Dad, Aunt Sarah, and Uncle David. They were in the kitchen this morning while you were getting dressed. They thought I was still asleep, but I came downstairs early. I couldn't sleep." My other 2 children, Sarah and David, had stayed over the night before to help with arrangements. They'd insisted it would be easiest if everyone left from my house, though at the last minute they decided to drive in separate cars. "What did they say?" I asked, though every part of me wanted not to hear the answer. Dean's face crumpled, and new tears spilled down his cheeks. They were talking about you, Grandma, about what would happen after today. And then Dad said something about making sure you don't make it to the funeral. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually staggered back, grabbing the car to steady myself. That can't be right, honey. You must have misunderstood. I didn't misunderstand, he insisted, his voice rising in panic. Dad said they had to make it look like an accident, that you were too heartbroken to drive safely. Uncle David mentioned the brakes, and Aunt Sarah, she laughed, Grandma. She actually laughed. The garage seemed to tilt around me. My own children, talking about harming me. It felt unthinkable. Yes, we'd had conflicts over the years, especially once Roman got sick. They'd been impatient about the medical bills, upset about the time his care demanded. They'd pushed me to consider putting him in a facility, and I had refused. But plotting to hurt me? Dean, are you completely sure about what you heard? I asked, my voice barely steady. He nodded quickly. I recorded some of it on my phone, he said, pulling the device from his pocket with trembling hands. I didn't catch everything they said, but I heard enough. Grandma, they want you dead. The word dead hung between us like something solid. My knees went weak and I had to lean against the car to stay upright. This couldn't be real. Not today. Not ever. My phone started ringing inside my purse. The sharp sound made both Dean and me jump. I fumbled with the zipper, my hands shaking so badly it was hard to grip anything. Michael's name flashed on the screen. Don't answer, Dean said quickly, stepping closer. Please, Grandma, they're probably wondering where you are. They expected you to be gone by now. The phone rang again, the sound bouncing off the garage walls. Then it stopped, only to immediately start up again. This time it was Sarah. They're getting nervous, Dean whispered. We have to go, now. I stared at the screen as David's name appeared next, the third call in under 2 minutes. My children, the babies I'd carried, breastfed, rocked to sleep, loved without conditions, were calling to see if their plan to kill me had worked. Where can we go? I asked, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. There's a coffee shop about 6 blocks from here, Dean said. We can figure things out there, but we have to leave before they come looking for you. I looked at Roman's car one last time, remembering all the trips we'd taken, all the moments we'd shared in it. Then I thought about what Dean had told me, and for the first time in my life, when I thought about my children, I didn't feel love or worry. I felt fear. Okay, I said, closing my purse and taking Dean's arm. Let's go. We walked out to the street, leaving the garage door open and the car sitting there like evidence of a crime that never happened. My phone started ringing again as we moved away from the house. This time all 3 of my children were calling one after another, their names lighting up the screen like accusations. Don't answer, Dean begged again. And I didn't. As we hurried down the sidewalk, putting space between us and the home where I had raised a family that apparently wanted me dead, only one thought kept circling in my mind. If they had planned something for today, what else had they planned? And how long had my own children been waiting for me to die? The coffee shop was nearly empty at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. Most people were at work, living their ordinary lives, blissfully unaware that somewhere across town a funeral was beginning without the widow present. Dean and I chose a corner booth, the farthest seat from the windows where no one could easily see us from the street. I wrapped my hands around a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. The mug was warm, but inside I felt frozen. Dean sat across from me, his phone on the table between us like a piece of evidence in a trial. Play it, I said, even though every part of me dreaded what I was about to hear. Dean's finger hovered over the play button. Grandma, are you sure? Once you hear this, you can't unhear it? I nodded, unable to trust my voice. He tapped the screen, and suddenly my children's voices filled the small space between us. She's taking too long to get ready. Michael's voice snapped, impatient and sharp. The service starts in 45 minutes. Maybe that's for the best, Sarah replied, and I could hear the cruel smile in her tone. Gives us more time to make sure everything's set. Did you check the brake line? That was David, my youngest, the boy I'd helped with algebra homework and driven to countless soccer practices. Loosened just enough, Michael answered. It won't fail right away, but after a few miles on those mountain roads, well, accidents happen when people are grieving and distracted. I clapped a hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. Dean reached across the table and squeezed my other hand. The insurance will pay out quickly for an accidental death, Sarah went on. And with Dad gone, she was going to leave everything to us eventually. This just speeds up the timeline. Speeds up the timeline. The casual way she said it, like they were discussing a project at work instead of murdering their own mother, made my stomach turn. I still think we could have waited, David said, though there was no real conviction in his voice. Maybe found a care facility. Michael cut him off. And waste thousands every month keeping her comfortable while our inheritance shrinks? Dad's cancer bills already took a chunk out of the estate. We can't afford to wait years for her to die naturally. Besides, Sarah added with a cold laugh that made my blood run ice cold, she's been so dramatic about her grief. Everyone will understand why she lost control of the car. Poor thing just couldn't live without her precious Roman. Dean stopped the recording. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. I sat there staring at the table, trying to process what I'd just heard. These were my children. I had brought them into this world, raised them, sacrificed for them, stayed up all night when they had fevers, cheered at their school events, helped them through divorces, job losses, heartbreaks, every crisis they'd ever had. And now they were plotting to kill me. For money. There's more, Dean said softly. They talked about the will, about your assets. They already know exactly how much everything is worth. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Dad said $1.8 million, Dean replied. Between the house, Grandpa Roman's life insurance, and your retirement accounts, $1,800,000. Not an unimaginable fortune, but clearly it was enough to kill for. They've been planning this for a while, I said. It wasn't a question. Dean nodded. Dad mentioned they've talked about it several times. Aunt Sarah said they already spoke to a lawyer about speeding up the probate process. I closed my eyes, thinking back to the last weeks of Roman's life, how suddenly my children had become so attentive, so available. Michael had insisted on taking over the finances to relieve my stress. Sarah had started asking very specific questions about my will and our insurance policies. David had been researching grief counseling and services for seniors. I'd thought they were being caring. I'd been grateful. They were preparing, I said slowly. While Roman was dying, they were setting everything up. There's something else, Dean murmured, his voice dropping even lower. About Grandpa Roman. My heart clenched. What about him? Dean stared down at his hands. They said it was convenient his pain medication made him so confused at the end that it would have been a problem if he'd been clear-headed enough to change his will or ask questions about the money. The implication hit me like a physical punch. Roman had been strangely out of it in those last weeks, sleeping more than usual, drifting in and out, sometimes looking at me with cloudy eyes like he didn't quite know who I was. The doctor had said it was normal for a terminal cancer patient, a mix of strong painkillers and the disease itself. But what if it wasn't normal? What if someone had made sure he stayed confused and easy to control? They drugged him, I whispered. They kept him sedated so he couldn't interfere with their plans. I think so, Dean said, his eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry, Grandma. I should have seen something sooner. I should have protected you both. Oh, sweetheart, I said, reaching across the table to take his hands. None of this is your fault. You're the only one who did protect us. My phone had been buzzing nonstop beside my coffee cup. 16 missed calls, with messages piling up one after another. I finally picked it up and scrolled through them. Michael, where are you? The service is starting. Sarah, Mom, please call. We're worried sick. David, are you okay? Everyone is asking where you are. Michael again. This is embarrassing. Dad wouldn't want you to miss his own funeral. That last message made me want to hurl the phone across the room. They were still using Roman's memory as a tool to manipulate me. They're panicking now, Dean said quietly. They probably realized something went wrong when you didn't show up. What happens now? I asked. They'll come looking for me eventually. We have to be smart, Dean said. We can't just confront them. They'll deny everything, say you misheard, say I faked the recording, and with only this audio, it might not be enough. He was right. As powerful as the recording was, it might not stand on its own, and if I cornered them while they were desperate, there was no telling what they might do. We need to get back to the house before they do, I said, my mind racing. I have to go through Roman's medical records, see if there's any proof of what they did to him, and I need to see what Michael has been doing with our financial accounts. That's risky, Dean warned. What if they come back while we're there? The funeral won't be over yet. They'll have to stay for the reception, play the dutiful grieving children. That gives us maybe 2 hours. Dean hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but we go together. And if we hear them coming back, we leave. No arguments. As we got ready to leave the coffee shop, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked exactly like what everyone expected me to be that day. A broken widow, fragile and heartbroken. But under that grief, something else was forming, something harder. The woman who had raised 3 children, nursed her husband through cancer, and worked for decades to build a life was not going to be killed for money, not by strangers, and certainly not by her own children. Dean, I said as we walked back toward the house, I need you to promise me something. Anything, Grandma. Whatever we find in that house, whatever proof we uncover, we're going to be very careful with it. I won't let them destroy what your grandfather and I built. And I won't let them get away with what they've done. He squeezed my arm. What are you planning? I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally seen her enemies clearly, someone who would never underestimate them again. I'm thinking they just showed me exactly how ruthless I need to be. The house felt different when we slipped in through the back door. It was the same place I'd lived for 23 years, the same kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, the same hallway lined with family photos. But now it felt hostile, a crime scene in disguise, a place where my children had sat, drinking coffee and planning my death while I slept upstairs. We need to move quickly, I whispered as we headed for Roman's study. Check his desk. I'll look through the medical files. Roman had always been meticulous with paperwork. Every doctor's visit, every prescription, every insurance claim, everything was filed in strict order in the metal cabinet next to his mahogany desk. If there was evidence of what they'd done, it would be hidden somewhere in there. I pulled out a folder labeled Medical, Final 6 Months, and spread its contents across the desk. The story was laid out in cold print. Roman's pain medication dosage had been increased 4 times in his last 8 weeks of life. Each increase had been requested by family members calling the doctor's office to report that he was in unbearable pain and couldn't sleep. But that wasn't how I remembered it. Roman had been handling his pain reasonably well until the final month. He'd been alert, still himself, still the sharp, clever man I'd fallen in love with. It was only after Michael started helping with his medication schedule that Roman had become foggy and distant. "Grandma," Dean called softly from behind the desk, "you need to see this." He was holding a manila envelope with my name written on the front in Roman's careful handwriting. Underneath my name, in smaller letters, he'd added, "To be opened only after my death and only if something seems wrong." My hands trembled as I tore the envelope open. Inside was a letter dated just 3 weeks before Roman died, along with printed emails and what looked like bank statements. "My dearest Phyllis," the letter began, and seeing his writing hit me with fresh grief. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and something has happened that made you suspicious enough to look for this letter. I pray I'm wrong about what I suspect, but if I'm right, this information may save your life." I had to stop for a moment, pressing my hand to my chest just to breathe. Roman had known. Somehow he had known what our children were capable of. I've been pretending to be more confused than I really am these past few weeks. The letter continued. The medication they're giving me does make me drowsy, but I'm still aware of what's happening around me. I've heard things, Phyllis, conversations between our children that no parent should ever have to hear. The room seemed to tilt as I read. Roman hadn't been as lost as he'd seemed. Even while battling cancer, he'd been paying attention, listening, and trying to protect us both. They think I don't remember the meeting they had in our bedroom while I was sleeping 2 weeks ago. The letter continued. Michael brought papers for me to sign, said they were medical directives, but I recognized Sarah's handwriting in the margins. They were financial documents, asset transfers that would take effect immediately after my death. They're planning to control everything before you even have time to grieve. I glanced up at Dean, who was reading over my shoulder. His face was pale, but there was a hard resolve in his expression. But that's not the worst part, Roman had written. Yesterday, I overheard David on the phone, discussing what would happen after I'm gone. He said you wouldn't be around long enough for it to matter anyway. The way he said it, Phyllis, he wasn't talking about natural death. My vision blurred with tears. Roman had spent his last weeks knowing our children were planning to kill me, and he hadn't been able to stop them directly. I've taken precautions, the letter went on. Inside this envelope, you'll find printed copies of emails between our children from the past month. I accessed them using Michael's laptop when he left it open in the living room. They discussed their plans in detail, including their research into accidental death insurance payouts and how to avoid an investigation. With shaking hands, I pulled out the printed emails. The first was from Sarah to her brothers, dated 18 days earlier. The old man is getting sicker faster than we expected, it read. This could actually work in our favor if we time things right. Mom will be vulnerable and grief-stricken. People will understand if she has an accident shortly after losing him. The next email was Michael's reply. I've been looking into insurance policies. Accidental death pays out faster and with fewer questions than natural death. We just need to get the timing right. Not so soon after Dad's funeral that it looks suspicious, but soon enough that she doesn't have time to change her will or start giving money to charity. David had responded, I found information about brake failures being very hard to trace, especially if the victim has been stressed and neglecting vehicle maintenance. I can handle the mechanical side. I felt physically ill reading my youngest son's cold, technical outline of how to kill me. David, the same boy who used to curl up in my lap during thunderstorms, the child I'd cradled in my arms when he broke his arm falling from the oak tree in our backyard. There's more, Dean murmured, pointing to another email. This one is from Sarah, 5 days before Grandpa died. We need to keep him sedated enough that he doesn't start asking questions about his accounts, it said. I doubled his evening pain meds last night, told Mom the doctor called with new instructions. He was so out of it this morning he didn't even recognize her at first. Perfect. The puzzle pieces were locking together into a horrifying picture. My children hadn't just plotted my death, they had been slowly poisoning their father to stop him from interfering. The bank statements, I said, grabbing the remaining documents from the envelope. Roman said there were financial records. The statements showed recent activity I didn't recognize, small transfers from our joint checking account into an account I'd never heard of. $2,500 here, $1,800 there, amounts just small enough to get lost in the chaos of medical bills and funeral costs. Over 8 weeks they had siphoned off more than $12,000. They've been skimming, Dean said, mentally adding up the totals. And look at this, they opened the new account using forged signatures. I flipped to the signature card stapled to the back. There was my signature and Roman's, except I had never signed those papers. The handwriting was close, but not quite right. Sarah, I said immediately. She always had the neatest handwriting. She used to forge my signature on school permission slips in high school. Roman's letter continued for another full page, describing more disturbing conversations he'd overheard and subtle changes in our children's behavior over the past few months. But it was the final paragraph that struck deepest. Phyllis, my love, I wish I could shield you from this, but my time is running out. They're doing everything they can to keep me too medicated to think clearly, and I'm not strong enough to fight both the cancer and them, but you are strong enough. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. Don't let them destroy what we built. Don't let them win." At the very bottom, he'd written one last instruction. "Check the safe. The combination is our anniversary date. There's something there you'll need." I looked at Dean. "Did you know about a safe?" "In their bedroom," he said, "behind the painting of the lake house. Grandpa showed it to me when I was little." We went upstairs, moving as quietly as possible. Every creak of the floorboards made us pause and listen for any sign of the children returning. The house stayed silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the minutes until the reception ended and they'd come looking for me. The safe was exactly where Dean said it would be, hidden behind the watercolor of the cabin where Roman and I had spent our honeymoon. I turned the dial to our anniversary, June 14th, 1985, and felt the lock click open. Inside was another manila folder, stuffed with documents I'd never seen before. "What is it?" Dean asked as I pulled the papers out. I read the first page twice before I could accept what it said. It was a new will, dated 1 week before Roman died, properly notarized by his longtime attorney James Morrison. But this will was nothing like the one Roman and I had talked about. Instead of leaving everything equally to our children, it created a trust. Dean would inherit 25% of our assets when he turned 21 and another 25% when he turned 30. The remaining 50% was designated for the National Cancer Research Foundation. Our children were cut out completely. "He knew," I whispered. "Roman knew what they were planning, and he protected us both." But there was still one more document in the folder, one that made my blood run cold. It was a photocopy of life insurance policies I hadn't even known existed, policies Michael had taken out on both Roman and me in the last 6 months, with himself, Sarah, and David listed as beneficiaries. The combined payout totaled $800,000. "They insured us like livestock," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "They've been setting this up for months, preparing for the moment they murdered us." Dean read over my shoulder, disgust twisting his young features. "Look at the dates," he said. "They applied for these right after Grandpa's diagnosis got worse." A sound from downstairs made us both freeze, car doors slamming, voices in the driveway. They were home. "Quick!" I hissed, shoving Roman's letter and all the documents from the safe into my purse. "We have to get out of here." We crept toward the back staircase, but before we could reach it, Michael's voice drifted up from the kitchen. "Her car is still in the garage," he was saying. "So where the hell is she?" "Maybe she walked to a neighbor's house," Sarah suggested. "She's always been close with that Patterson woman next door." "No," David said, and I could hear the tension in his voice. "Something's wrong. She should have been in an accident by now. The brake line was definitely compromised." "Well, clearly something went wrong with your brilliant plan," Sarah snapped. "So now what?" "We moved to the backup plan," Michael replied, his voice turning icy. "We find her, convince her she's too grief-stricken to be making decisions, and get her to sign the conservatorship papers. Once we have legal control, we can figure out a more permanent solution." They were standing in my kitchen, surrounded by sympathy casseroles from kind neighbors, calmly discussing alternate ways to kill me. I looked at Dean and saw the same hard resolve I felt inside reflected in his eyes. We had what we needed now, Roman's last gift to us, the truth about what our children had become. Now we just had to live long enough to use it. Dean and I slipped quietly out the back door while my children argued in the kitchen about where I might have gone. We hurried next door to Mrs. Patterson's house, where I'd spent countless afternoons over the years sharing coffee and neighborhood gossip. Eleanor Patterson had been my closest friend since we moved to Maple Street. When I knocked, tear-streaked and shaken, she didn't bombard me with questions. She simply opened her arms and pulled us inside. "Fi, dear, what on earth happened at the funeral?" Eleanor asked once we were settled in her living room. "Michael called here about 20 minutes ago asking if I'd seen you. He sounded frantic." "I need to use your phone," I said, pulling Roman's documents back out of my purse. "And I need you to witness something very important." Over the next hour, I made 3 phone calls that changed everything. First, I called James Morrison, Roman's lawyer, and asked him to come to Eleanor's house immediately. Second, I called the police non-emergency line to report suspected elder abuse, fraud, and a planned homicide. Third, I contacted my bank and ordered them to freeze all accounts Michael had access to. While we waited for Mr. Morrison to arrive, Dean and I told Eleanor everything. We played her the recording of my children calmly planning my accidental death and showed her the evidence Roman had hidden. "Those monsters," she whispered when we finished. "To think I've been bringing them casseroles and asking how they're holding up, and all that time they were plotting to kill their own mother." James Morrison arrived within 40 minutes, his usual composure shaken as he examined Roman's hidden will and the rest of the evidence. He confirmed that the new will was legally valid and that Roman had specifically instructed him not to mention it until after the funeral. "Roman was very worried about your safety, Phyllis," Mr. Morrison said, adjusting his glasses as he reread the documents. "He came to my office 3 weeks ago extremely agitated. He insisted we change everything right away. He said he'd discovered something that made him fear for your life." "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. "He was afraid your conversations were being monitored," the lawyer replied. "He said your children had become very controlling about his medication and about who was allowed to see him. He wanted to protect you, but he also wanted solid legal proof of what they were doing." As if summoned by his words, the doorbell rang. Through Eleanor's front window, I could see Michael's Mercedes parked in the driveway. "They found us," Dean whispered. Eleanor squeezed my hand. "Do you want me to say you're not here?" I thought about Roman's letter, about his faith in my strength. "No," I said finally. "It's time to face them." Eleanor opened the door to find all 3 of my children standing on her porch. To an outsider, they would have looked like any grieving family, but I could see the calculating coldness in their eyes. "Mrs. Patterson," Michael said with forced politeness, "we're looking for our mother. We're very worried about her." "She missed Dad's funeral," Sarah added, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "We think she might be having some kind of breakdown." "She's here," I called from the living room before Eleanor could answer. "Come in, we need to talk." They walked into the living room, their expressions shifting from concerned to wary when they saw Mr. Morrison seated beside me, legal papers spread across the coffee table. "Mom," David said slowly, "what's going on? We've been worried sick. Why didn't you come to the funeral?" "Sit down," I said, my voice calm but icy. "All of you." They exchanged uneasy looks, but did as they were told, sitting on Eleanor's couch across from me like defendants waiting for a verdict. "I know what you did," I said plainly. "I know what you planned, and I know exactly why I'm still alive." Michael's face went a shade paler, but he tried to keep up his act as the worried son. "Mom, you're not making any sense. The stress of losing Dad—" "Stop," I cut him off, lifting Roman's letter. "I found this. Your father knew exactly what you were planning." Sarah leaned forward, trying to see the paper. "What is that?" "A letter from your father," I replied. "In it, he describes every conversation he overheard, every scheme you discussed, every step you took to steal from us and plan our deaths." For a moment, Michael's mask slipped, and I saw what he really was: cold, vicious, calculating. "That's impossible," he snapped. "Dad was barely coherent those last weeks." "Because you drugged him," Dean cut in, his young voice trembling with anger. "You overdosed his pain meds to keep him quiet while you drained their accounts and plotted to kill Grandma." "Dean," David said, trying for a calm, reasonable tone, "you don't understand how complicated adult situations are." "I understand murder," Dean shot back. "I recorded you this morning talking about loosening Grandma's brake lines." The silence that followed was absolute. They stared at Dean, then at me, and I watched their pretenses crumble. Sarah recovered first. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said sharply. "We've been taking care of you both, sacrificing our time and energy." "Sacrificing?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You've stolen over $12,000 from our accounts in the last 2 months. You took out life insurance policies on your father and me without our knowledge. You slowly poisoned Roman so he'd stay docile. And this morning, you sabotaged my car, hoping I'd die on the way to his funeral." Michael shot to his feet, face flushed. "You ungrateful old woman, do you have any idea what we've had to deal with? Dad's medical bills, his constant whining, your helplessness." "Michael," David hissed, trying to rein him in, but it was too late. "No," Michael went on, voice rising. "I'm done pretending. We've wasted months of our lives dealing with this. Dad should have died in a hospital where professionals could handle him, and you should be in a care home where you can't make these crazy accusations." Sarah grabbed his arm, but he shook her off and continued pacing Eleanor's small living room. "We were trying to fix everything," he said. "You and Dad are too old to manage money properly. The inheritance was going to be split between us anyway. We just sped up the process." "By murder," Mr. Morrison said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since they arrived, and his voice carried the calm weight of the law. "It wasn't murder," David blurted. It would have been an accident. People die in car crashes all the time." "And Dad was dying anyway," I finished for him, my voice trembling with controlled rage. "So you helped him along. You poisoned your own father." Sarah finally dropped the pretense of grief altogether. "He was suffering," she snapped. "We were being merciful." "Merciful," I repeated, "by drugging him so he couldn't think clearly enough to stop you from stealing from us." "We weren't stealing," Sarah shot back. "That money was going to be ours anyway. We were just accessing our inheritance early." "Your inheritance," I said, picking up the document Roman had hidden in the safe, "doesn't exist anymore." I handed the will to Mr. Morrison. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "I, Roman Edward Carmichael, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils." As he read the terms, Dean's trust, the donation to cancer research, the complete disinheritance of my 3 children, I watched their expressions shift from confusion to shock to pure fury. "That's not possible," Michael said when Mr. Morrison finished. "Dad wouldn't have done that. He was too confused, too drugged." "The will was properly witnessed and notarized," Mr. Morrison replied calmly. "Roman was mentally competent when he signed. I can personally attest to that." "This is Dean's fault," Sarah snapped, turning on her nephew with venom. "You turned him against us. You manipulated a sick old man." "I saved him," Dean said quietly, "and I saved Grandma." David stared at the will, stunned. $800,000 to charity, 25% to Dean. He looked at me. "Mom, you can't let this stand. You can contest it. Say Dad wasn't mentally competent." "Why?" I asked. "Would I challenge a will that protects me and everything your father and I built from 3 people who tried to kill me?" "We never tried to murder you," Michael said, but even he sounded unconvinced. I took out my phone and pressed play. Their own voices filled the room, talking about brake lines, insurance payouts, making my death look like a tragic accident. When the recording ended, Michael's shoulders sagged. "You don't understand the pressure we're under," he said. "Our mortgages, our kids' tuition, the economy." "So you decided the solution to your financial problems was to kill your parents?" I asked. "Is that what you're saying to me right now?" Sarah lurched to her feet, her face twisted with anger. "You have no right to judge us," she spat. "You and Dad had it easy. Houses were cheap, jobs were stable, you could raise a family on one salary. We're drowning in debt while you sit on nearly $2 million you'll never use." $2 million that I earned over 40 years of work and careful saving," I answered. "Money your father and I plan to use for our retirement, our medical needs, maybe a little traveling in our so-called golden years." "What golden years?" David said bitterly. "Dad's dead and you're 63. How many years do you really have left? 10? 15? Meanwhile, we can barely afford groceries for our kids." I looked at my youngest son, remembering the little boy who used to bring me crooked Mother's Day cards made of construction paper and glue. "So you decided I didn't deserve those years," I said softly. "You decided to take them from me." "We decided to be practical," Michael replied, his voice like ice. "You're old, Mom. This is the natural order of things. Children inherit from their parents. We just wanted to skip the part where we had to wait for you to rot slowly in some nursing home." The casual cruelty of his words knocked the air out of me. These were my children, the babies I had nursed, loved, and sacrificed everything for, talking about my murder like it was a reasonable financial strategy. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom," David began, "get out of this house. Get out of my life. All of you." "You can't just cut us off," Sarah said, panic slipping into her voice. "We're your children." "No," I said, rising to my feet and facing the three people who had once meant everything to me. "You're strangers who happen to share my DNA. My children died the moment you decided my life was worth less than your convenience." They left, but they didn't leave gently. Michael slammed Eleanor's front door so hard her china cabinet rattled. Sarah shouted from the driveway that I would regret this. David only looked shattered, as if he was finally starting to understand how far they'd gone. As we watched their car pull away, Mr. Morrison calmly gathered the documents from the coffee table. "I'll file the police report regarding the insurance fraud and the theft from your accounts," he said. "Between Roman's evidence and Dean's recording, there should be more than enough for criminal charges." I nodded, though I felt empty. We'd won, technically, but it felt like ashes in my mouth. "Grandma?" Dean asked softly. "Are you okay?" I looked at my grandson, this brave boy who had saved my life and helped uncover the truth. One day, he'd inherit a large sum, but more importantly, he would be able to live knowing he'd done what was right when it mattered most. "I will be," I said. And for the first time since the nightmare started, I actually believed it. 3 days after the confrontation at Eleanor's house, I did something my children would never anticipate. I called them and invited them to dinner. "I've been thinking about what happened," I told Michael when he answered. I deliberately softened my voice, letting it sound unsure, fragile. "Maybe I overreacted. Maybe we should talk this through as a family." There was a long pause. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" he asked carefully. "I'm lonely," I said, and that part was true. "This house feels so empty without your father. I keep thinking about what you said, about the natural order of things, about family sticking together. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been selfish." I could practically hear the relief wash through him. "I'm glad you're being reasonable," he said. "We never wanted to hurt you. We were just trying to plan for everyone's future." "I know," I replied, layering my words with weary resignation. "Will you come to dinner on Saturday? All of you. Bring the kids. I want the whole family together." "Of course," Michael said quickly. "Mom, this is the right decision. We can work everything out." After I hung up, Dean looked at me with concern. He'd been staying with me since Roman's funeral, sleeping in the guest room and helping me process everything we'd uncovered. "Grandma, what are you planning?" he asked. "Justice," I said simply. "Your grandfather spent his last weeks gathering evidence to protect us. Now we're going to use it." Over the next 3 days, I prepared for what would be the most important dinner party of my life. I called my sister Margaret, who lived 2 hours away in Columbus, and asked her to come with her family for the weekend. I invited Roman's brother William and his wife Helen. I reached out to cousins, old family friends, and neighbors who had been close to us for years. "It's a memorial gathering," I told each of them, "a chance to celebrate Roman's life with the people who loved him most." What I didn't say was that it would also be a reckoning. Mr. Morrison helped me prepare the necessary legal documents. He kept in contact with the police about the fraud and insurance issues, and Detective Sarah Chen assured us that charges would be filed once their investigation was complete. But I wanted more than a criminal case. I wanted my children to face what they'd done in front of the very people who had watched them grow up. On Saturday afternoon, I spent hours cooking Roman's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, fresh dinner rolls, and apple pie. The house filled with the familiar smells of warmth and family, of comfort and safety. It felt bitterly ironic to prepare a feast for people who had wished me dead. Dean helped me set the table in the formal dining room we usually reserved for holidays. I brought out our wedding china, the delicate blue and white set Roman had surprised me with on our 10th anniversary. "Are you sure about this?" Dean asked as we folded napkins and laid them by each plate. "I'm sure," I said. "Your grandfather always believed the truth should be spoken clearly and without apology. That's exactly what we're going to do tonight." The first to arrive were Margaret and her family. One look at my face and my sister knew something was wrong. "Phyllis," she said quietly, once her husband and daughters were in the living room. "What's really going on? You sounded strange on the phone." "You'll understand soon," I promised. "But Margaret, I need you to know one thing. Whatever happens tonight, Dean and I are safe now." Her eyes widened, alarmed, but before she could question me further, Roman's brother William and his wife Helen arrived. Then came the neighbors, the old friends, the cousins I hadn't seen in months. By 6 o'clock, the house was full of people who had truly loved Roman, and I hoped still cared about me. Michael, Sarah, and David arrived together at 6:15 with their children. Michael's twins, Emily and Jake, Sarah's daughter Sophie, and David's son Marcus were clearly confused by the crowd, but thrilled to see their cousins. "Mom?" Sarah said, pulling me aside in the kitchen. "I thought this was going to be just family." "It is family," I replied. "Everyone here loved your father." Michael looked around the busy living room with thinly veiled irritation. "This seems like a lot of people for a private conversation." "Oh, we'll have our private conversation," I assured him, "after dinner." The meal itself felt almost surreal. I sat at the head of the table where Roman used to sit, watching my children make small talk with relatives and neighbors, perfectly playing the roles of grieving siblings supporting their widowed mother. They were good, so good that if I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed they genuinely cared about my well-being. Margaret sat on my right, William on my left. Dean was directly across from me, his quiet presence steadying me. My 3 children were spread out around the table with their families, probably to avoid clustering together in case they needed to appear less coordinated later. "Roman would have loved this," Helen said during a lull in conversation. "He always said food tasted better when it was shared with people you love." "He did say that," I agreed. "He also used to say that the most important thing in life was family trust. That once you lost that, you'd lost everything." I saw Michael and Sarah exchange a quick look across the table. "Dad was always full of wisdom like that," David said, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, he was," I replied. "In fact, he left behind quite a bit of wisdom for all of us, some of it in writing." After dinner, I served coffee and pie in the living room while the grandchildren played in the backyard. When everyone had settled with their dessert, I stood by the fireplace, where Roman and I had renewed our vows 23 years ago. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," I began. Roman would have been deeply touched to see so many people who cared about him gathered in our home. Soft murmurs of agreement moved through the room. As many of you know, Roman was a careful, thorough man. He believed in planning ahead and making sure his family would be provided for, no matter what happened. Michael shifted in his chair. Sarah stared down into her coffee. "Before he died, Roman left me some documents, letters actually, that he wanted me to share with all of you, so you'd understand what kind of man he really was." I took Roman's letter from the manila envelope I'd placed on the mantel. "This is dated 3 weeks before Roman's death," I said. "He was very ill, but his mind was completely clear when he wrote it." "Mom," Michael said, starting to get up, "maybe this should be private." "Sit down," I said firmly. Something in my tone made him obey. "Everyone here loved your father. They have a right to hear his final words." I began reading the letter aloud, starting with his explanation that he'd been pretending to be more confused than he really was. The room fell completely silent as I read his account of overhearing our children's conversations, their plans to control our finances, their casual talk about my death. Margaret gasped when I reached the part about the life insurance policies. William's face darkened with anger. Neighbors and family friends stared, stunned, trying to process what they were hearing. "This can't be true," Helen whispered. Unfortunately, it is, I said. I nodded to Dean. He took out his phone and played the recording he'd made the morning of Roman's funeral. My children's voices filled the room, discussing brake lines, insurance payouts, and how to make my death look like an accident. When the recording ended, the silence was suffocating. Margaret stared at her niece and nephews in horror. "How could you?" she asked hoarsely. "How could you plan to kill your own mother?" "It's not what it sounds like," Sarah said desperately, looking around at the people who'd known her since she was a little girl. "They're taking everything out of context." "Context!" William exploded, rising to his feet, face flushed. "What possible context makes it acceptable to plan your mother's murder?" "We weren't trying to murder anyone," David said, though even he didn't sound convinced. We were talking hypothetically." "Hypothetical brake line failures?" I asked. "Hypothetical insurance payouts? Hypothetical timelines for my death?" Eleanor Patterson, who had already witnessed everything at her house 3 days earlier, shook her head sadly. "I've known these kids since they were babies," she said. "I can't believe what they've turned into." "The worst part," I continued, "is that they started putting their plan into motion while Roman was still alive. They overdosed him on pain medication to keep him confused and compliant. They stole from our accounts. They took out life insurance policies on both of us without our knowledge." I handed copies of the bank statements and policy documents to Margaret and William. As they read, their expressions grew more horrified. $800,000, Margaret said, staring at the papers. "You insured your parents like they were property?" Michael finally spoke, the mask gone. "You have no idea what it's like," he said bitterly. "Watching your parents sit on money while your own kids can't afford college, knowing there's nearly $2 million just sitting there while we're barely hanging on to our houses." "So you decided to kill us for it," I said flatly. "We decided to be practical," Sarah snapped, seemingly forgetting the room was full of witnesses. "You're old. Dad was dying anyway. We were just trying to solve everyone's problems efficiently." The gasps and outraged whispers that followed seemed to finally pierce her denial. She looked around at the stunned faces of relatives and neighbors, realizing too late that she'd just admitted to a murder plot in front of about 20 witnesses. "Sarah," David hissed, but the damage was done. "You did solve your problems," I said, "just not in the way you expected." I picked up the final document I'd set aside, the one that would close this chapter of my life for good. "Roman left behind one more surprise for you," I announced. "A new will, properly witnessed and notarized, that he signed 1 week before his death. In the will, Roman left 25% of our assets to Dean when he turns 21, another 25% when he turns 30, and the remaining 50% to the National Cancer Research Foundation. The 3 of you get nothing." The color drained from Michael's face. "That's not possible. He was too sick to make legal decisions." "Mr. Morrison can confirm he was completely competent," I said. "But it doesn't really matter now because I've decided to honor Roman's wishes exactly as they are." I held up the document I'd signed that very morning. "This is my own new will. It mirrors your father's. Dean will inherit from me when the time comes. The 3 of you will not." "You can't do that," Sarah snapped, panic sharpening her voice. "We're your children." "No," I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "You stopped being my children the moment you decided I was worth more dead than alive. You're strangers to me now." David was crying, which actually surprised me. "Mom, please," he begged. "We made a mistake, but we're still family." "Family doesn't try to kill each other for money," William said with disgust. "Roman was right to cut you off." Margaret stood and moved to my side. "Phyllis, you can come stay with us as long as you need," she said. "You shouldn't be alone in this house." "Thank you," I replied. "But I'm not alone. I have Dean." I looked at my grandson, the only one who had acted with integrity, the only one who had truly honored our family. He would be the one to carry our name forward in a way Roman could be proud of. "I think it's time to end this gathering," I said. "To those of you who truly loved Roman, thank you for coming. To those who didn't, I turned my gaze on my 3 children. Please leave my house, and don't come back. As the real guests began to leave, offering hugs and promises to stay in touch, Michael made one last attempt. "Mom, you'll regret this," he warned. "When you're old and sick and need someone to take care of you, we won't be there." I smiled at him, and there was nothing kind in it. I'm counting on that. After everyone was gone, Dean and I sat together in the quiet living room, surrounded by empty cups and pie plates. For the first time since Roman's death, the house felt calm. "Do you think Grandpa would be proud of us?" Dean asked. I thought of Roman's letter, of his faith in my strength and his plea not to let them win. "I think he's finally at peace," I said. "And so am I." 6 months after that final dinner, I sat on the front porch of my new home in Millfield, a small town about 60 miles from where Roman and I had spent most of our married life. The house was smaller, but just right for me. 2 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen, and a garden where I could grow tomatoes and roses, the ones Roman always loved. Dean sat beside me on the porch swing, working on homework for his junior year. He'd transferred to Millfield High when we moved. I had worried about uprooting him, but he'd adapted wonderfully. He'd even joined the soccer team, something he'd never had time for when he was busy protecting me from his father and aunts. "A letter came from Mr. Morrison today," I said, lifting the official-looking envelope that had arrived with the afternoon mail. Dean looked up from his history book. "Good news or bad news?" "Good," I said, opening it. "The criminal trial is set for next month. All 3 of them are going to plead guilty to fraud and conspiracy." The police investigation had moved quickly once Detective Chen had all the evidence Roman had collected. The insurance fraud alone was enough to put them behind bars, but the recording about sabotaging my car had sealed everything. Their own attorneys had told them that if they fought the charges, they'd only end up with harsher sentences. "How long?" Dean asked. "Michael gets 5 years as the mastermind," I said. "Sarah and David each get 3 years, with a chance at parole after 18 months for cooperating." I felt nothing when I read it. No triumph, no grief. Just a clean, cold sense of closure. They had once been the center of my universe, but they had chosen greed over love. The justice system could have them now. "There's something else," I added, pulling out another document from the envelope. "The civil case is settled. The insurance company is paying the full $800,000 in damages for the fraudulent policies they took out." Dean let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of money." "It is," I agreed, "and I've decided what to do with it." I'd been thinking about this for months. From the moment Mr. Morrison told me about the settlement, the money had felt dirty, tainted by my children's attempt to profit from my death. I didn't want to keep it for myself. "I'm creating a scholarship fund at the community college," I said. "For students who aged out of foster care or don't have any family support, we're calling it the Dean Carmichael Scholarship Fund." Dean flushed and ducked his head. "Grandma, you don't have to name it after me." "Yes, I do," I said firmly. "You're the only member of this family who acted with honor when it mattered. Your grandfather would want his name tied to helping young people who have to make their own way in life, just like you did." It was true. Dean had essentially been on his own since he was 14, when Michael became so obsessed with money and inheritance that he stopped being a real father. Dean had raised himself, and he'd done a better job than any of my children had managed with all their advantages. The scholarship would cover full tuition and living expenses for 2 students a year, renewable for up to 4 years. Mr. Morrison had helped structure it so it would continue long after I was gone, funded by the insurance settlement and a portion of my own estate. "Have you heard from any of them?" Dean asked quietly. He never called them by name anymore. They were just them or they, the people who used to be our family. "Sarah writes from prison sometimes," I said. "She asks for forgiveness, says she's learned her lesson." I didn't mention how often the letters came, every few weeks, neat handwriting on prison stationery. They were full of apologies and rationalizations, stories about financial pressure and momentary lapses in judgment. She seemed to truly believe it was all just a mistake, a brief insanity that could be erased with enough "I'm sorries." "I don't answer," I continued. I read each letter once, and then I throw it away. Some things are unforgivable, not because I'm incapable of forgiveness, but because forgiving them would mean pretending that trying to murder your own mother for money is something a person can simply move on from. Nothing, I said. Michael's too proud to apologize, and David's too ashamed. I think that's for the best. Just then, a car pulled into the driveway, Eleanor Patterson's familiar blue Honda. She'd been driving down to visit us every other weekend since we moved, insisting she needed to make sure we were settling in properly. The truth was, I think she was just as lonely as we were. "Phyllis," she called, climbing out of the car with a covered dish in her hands. "I brought that casserole you like, and a bit of news from the old neighborhood." Eleanor had become our lifeline to our former world, bringing us updates about neighbors and mutual friends. Most of it was ordinary: who was putting their house up for sale, whose grandchildren were visiting, whose garden was surviving the unusually dry summer. "Mrs. Chan wants to know if you'd be willing to speak to her police training class," Eleanor said, as she settled into the wicker chair across from our porch swing. "About recognizing elder abuse and financial crimes. She says your case is being used as a teaching example." I thought about that. Detective Chen had handled everything with such care and respect, treating me as a victim of a crime, not as a silly old woman who should have noticed sooner. "I think I'd like that," I said, "if it helps other families avoid what we went through." "And there's more news," Eleanor added, her expression turning more serious. "Your old house sold." I felt a small, inevitable ache at that, though I'd known it was coming. The house where Roman and I had built our life, raised our children, celebrated holidays, that home had been sold to help cover my children's legal fees and restitution to the insurance company. "Who bought it?" I asked. "A young couple with twin babies," she said. "He's a doctor, she's a teacher. They seem lovely. They're already talking about putting a playground in the backyard." I smiled at that. There would be children in the yard again. Laughter, noise, the beautiful chaos of family life. Maybe this new family would become everything mine never managed to be. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. As the sun dipped behind the maple trees along our street, Eleanor headed back to her car. Dean went inside to shower and start dinner. In the months since we'd moved, he'd become an excellent cook, quietly taking on most of the household tasks without needing to be asked. I stayed on the porch swing a little longer, rocking gently as the evening cooled around me. This had always been my favorite time of day, the quiet hour when the work was done and the night ahead promised rest and a bit of peace. My phone buzzed with a text. I assumed it was Margaret checking in, as she did every few days, but the number was unfamiliar. "Mrs. Carmichael, this is Jessica from the Dean Carmichael Scholarship Fund. I wanted to let you know we've chosen our first 2 recipients. Would you like to meet them?" I smiled and typed back, "I would love that." The scholarship fund was already becoming more meaningful than I'd hoped. Jessica Martinez, the young woman I'd hired to administer it, had reached out to high schools and social service agencies across the county. The applications we received were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Young people who had endured abuse, neglect, and poverty, yet still clung to education and hope. Our first 2 recipients were Marcus Thompson, 18, who'd been in foster care since he was 12 and wanted to study automotive technology, and Elena Rodriguez, 19, who'd been supporting her younger siblings since their mother died and dreamed of becoming a nurse. "Grandma, dinner's ready," Dean called from inside. I rose from the swing, taking one last look at the quiet street where we'd begun this new chapter. Tomorrow, I would meet the first students whose lives would be changed by the scholarship bearing Dean's name. Next week, I would speak to Detective Chen's training class about spotting the signs of elder abuse. Next month, I would stand in court at my children's sentencing, not to ask for mercy, but to make sure the judge understood exactly what they'd tried to do. But tonight, I would simply have dinner with my grandson, the brave young man who had saved my life and helped me uncover the truth. We would talk about his soccer games, his upcoming SATs, his plans for college. We'd watch the evening news together and maybe a movie afterward. It was a simple life, but it was ours. We had each other. We were healthy, and we had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that we had fought for what was right, and won. As I walked into the kitchen, where Dean was setting the table for two, I thought about Roman's letter, about his belief in my strength and his confidence that I could protect what we'd built. He'd been right. I hadn't just protected it, I'd transformed it. The money my children were willing to kill for was now giving young people a chance at a future. The house where they'd plotted my death now belonged to a family that understood love. The inheritance they tried to steal was now serving a purpose they could never have imagined. "Smells amazing," I said, breathing in the scent of Dean's homemade chicken and dumplings. "Grandpa's recipe," he replied with a smile. "I found it in his cookbook." We sat down at our small table and Dean reached across to take my hand for grace, a tradition Roman had started when Dean was little, one we'd kept even after everything fell apart. "Thank you for this food," Dean said softly, "for our new home, and for keeping us safe and together." "Amen," I whispered. As we ate and talked about our day, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Complete peace. The nightmare was finally over. The people who had wanted to hurt us were facing justice. The money they'd tried to steal was being used to help others. And I was, at last, truly free. Outside the kitchen window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, I like to imagine Roman watching over us, smiling. His family, the real family, the one defined by love instead of blood, was safe, happy, and whole. After dinner, Dean and I moved to our cozy living room, him with his homework, me with a book I'd been meaning to start for months. The house was quiet, except for the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional car passing outside. At 9 o'clock, Dean closed his notebook, kissed my cheek, and headed upstairs. "Good night, Grandma. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart," I said. I stayed up a little longer, finishing my chapter and thinking about what tomorrow would bring. It would be Sunday, and we'd be driving to the community college to meet Marcus and Elena, the first two students chosen for our scholarship fund. They would never know the full story of how their education was being paid for, and that was perfectly fine. What mattered was that they would have the chance to build the future they dreamed of, without the financial desperation that had pushed my own children to such terrible choices. Before turning out the lights and heading upstairs, I paused at the small table by the front door where I kept Roman's photo. In it, he was smiling, eyes bright with the warmth and humor I'd fallen in love with 40 years earlier. "We did it," I whispered to his picture. "We protected what we built. We kept Dean safe. And we're going to help other people build something good, too." I touched my fingers to my lips, then gently to the frame. "Thank you for your letter. Thank you for teaching me how to be strong." Then I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, ready to sleep soundly for the first time since Roman's diagnosis. The war was over, and we had won. Not through violence or revenge, but through truth, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a grandmother and the grandson who saved her life. Morning would bring new challenges, new chances to help others, new ways to honor Roman's memory. But tonight, there was only peace and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed and a future secured. Dean was safe. The scholarship fund would support deserving students for generations, and I was free to live whatever years I had left on my own terms, surrounded by people who genuinely loved me. That was more than enough. It was everything. Now I'm curious about you, the one listening to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever experienced anything even remotely similar? Let me know in the comments. And on the final screen, I'm leaving you with 2 more of the channel's favorite stories. They'll definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching all the way to the end.